Married for 3 years, Bryce Horvitz doted on me endlessly. But I accidentally discovered his diary. Every word was filled with loathing towards me. Seeing her prosthetic limb, my interest disappears completely. What normal man would marry a cripple? How can I force her to divorce me? Later, I left behind a divorce agreement and left for another place. I heard that night, Bryce drove like a madman, chasing the high-speed train. He went completely crazy. Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. When Bryce Horvitz came home, I was sitting there blankly holding his diary, not knowing what to do. From the entrance came his clear voice. "Honey?" He called me several times but got no response. He started searching room by room. As he approached the study, I suddenly came back to my senses, stuffed the diary into the drawer, and quickly wiped away my tears. The door opened, and Bryce and I locked eyes. He saw my slightly red eyes and was stunned for a moment, then instinctively came over to hug me, his soft hair brushing against my cheek. His voice was hoarse and worried. "Have you been crying? Is your leg hurting again?" I didn't say anything. 3 years ago, a car accident took my left leg forever. Since then, every rainy season, the amputated area feels like it's being gnawed by thousands of insects. The pain is excruciating. But now, I'm crying, not because of that. Bryce picked me up by the waist, carried me into the bedroom, gently placed me on the bed, removed the prosthetic limb, and started massaging me. His touch was light, but skillful. I could feel that he must have put in a lot of effort to learn this. As he massaged, he looked up and instructed me. "Next time it hurts, call me. I'll come back to take care of you, don't endure it alone." I lowered my eyes, my gaze falling on his exquisitely handsome face. I started to wonder, is that a mask? The Bryce in the diary was full of disgust even mentioning my name. The Bryce in reality could calmly massage me. It was really jarring. I couldn't tell which was the real him. "What are you looking at?" I was still lost in thought when he suddenly brushed my nose lightly. Bryce's voice carried a hint of a smile. "Is there something on my face?" I pressed my lips together, clinging to a sliver of hope as I asked him. "Bryce, do you love me?" He was stunned for a few seconds, his eyes evasive, and he casually responded with a hum. Then he quickly changed the subject. "Get some rest. What do you want for dinner?" "I'll make it." Watching his retreating back, I curled my lips in self-mockery. "See?" He didn't even wait for my answer before running away. Married for 3 years, Bryce doted on me endlessly, taking care of me in every possible way. I always thought he loved me. But reality slapped me hard in the face. He married me, not out of love, but out of guilt. Because I lost my leg saving him. That car accident was an accident. 3 years ago, Bryce fell in love at first sight with the dance department's goddess, Maggie. Maggie and I were roommates. When they went on dates, Bryce brought me along, his childhood friend, hoping I could help him get closer to her. I suppressed my inner bitterness and agreed with a forced smile. No one knew. I had liked Bryce for over 10 years. So, when that out-of-control car came crashing towards us, I didn't hesitate to push Bryce out of the way. The result was, my left leg was shattered. The doctor said my leg was too severely damaged, reconstruction was difficult, and amputation was necessary. Outside the hospital room, my mom clutched Bryce's arm, crying hysterically. "It's all your fault. It's all because of you. Diane will never dance again in this life. What will she do in the future?" That was her dream. Bryce's white shirt was stained with my blood, and he knelt directly in front of my mom. "I'm sorry, really sorry. I will take responsibility." But I never expected that his way of taking responsibility was to marry me. On the day I was discharged, Bryce took me to get our marriage certificate. There was no proposal, no wedding. Just 2 thin marriage certificates. As we came out of the Civil Affairs Bureau, Maggie was standing under a tree not far away. When she approached, her eyes were red as she looked at Bryce. "Bryce, I'm going abroad. I wish you and Diane a long and happy life together." Bryce lowered his eyes, not even having the courage to look at her, the veins on his hand pushing the wheelchair standing out. After a long while, he said in a low voice, "Thank you. I hope you find happiness too." I was immersed in the sorrow of being disabled, completely unaware of how reluctant Bryce was. Oh, no. Actually, I did ask later why Bryce suddenly decided to marry me. My mom held my hand and said that men only marry the girls they like, telling me not to overthink it. Mrs. Horvitz served me chicken soup, saying that Bryce's pursuit of Maggie was just a whim and the car accident made him realize his true feelings. Bryce was too good to me, too gentle. I fell deeper and deeper into the trap. If it weren't for that diary, I might never have known. Those nights of passion that abruptly ended after helping me bathe, Bryce would write in his diary. Seeing her prosthetic limb, my interest disappears completely. Every anniversary, after making a lavish dinner, he would look at me tenderly while thinking, "What normal man would marry a cripple?" The diary ended yesterday. After work, he unusually brought me a bouquet of gardenias, masking the unfamiliar scent of perfume on him. That night, he wrote the last sentence in his diary. "How can I force her to divorce me? Because, yesterday, Maggie returned from abroad." That night, I couldn't sleep at all. The next day, when Bryce got up, I still hadn't figured out how to face him, so I pretended to be asleep. The side of the bed sank slightly. Bryce sat on the edge of the bed, quietly watched me for a while, then got up and left. Today was the weekend, and usually, if there was an urgent matter at the company that required overtime, he would inform me in advance. But this time, he didn't. I put on my prosthetic leg, changed into a long dress, and hailed a taxi to follow Bryce's car. The destination was a grand theater. When I saw the performer's photo on the screen, my heart sank heavily. It was Maggie. She had gone abroad for further studies for 3 years and had now become one of the top dancers in the country, with many students under her wing. When I bought a ticket and entered the venue, I saw a familiar figure walk on stage to present flowers to Maggie after her performance. The students in the audience were whispering, "Is he Miss Maggie's boyfriend? He looks so affectionate. He must be." They just hugged, and Miss Maggie's ears turned red. I have to say, they really make a perfect couple. I stood in the shadows and smiled self-mockingly. Indeed, they were a much better match than a cripple like me. After the curtain call, I went to the restroom, and when I came out, I saw Bryce and Maggie standing together. He had his hands in his pockets, looking down at her with a gentle smile on his face. "By the way, congratulations on your successful performance. Are you going to settle down in the country from now on?" Maggie smiled sweetly at him and replied, then suddenly changed the subject to me. "How are things between you and Diane? I heard that taking care of a disabled person can be both psychologically and physically exhausting." Bryce's smile faded, and his face darkened. It seemed that just thinking about me brought back unpleasant memories. He pressed his lips together, his tone very flat. "Yeah, you get used to it." My thoughts were in a daze for a moment. I suddenly remembered the time shortly after we got married. Because I could no longer stand on stage, I had lost my temper with Bryce several times. It was purely emotional outbursts. But he listened quietly, absorbing all my negative emotions. In the end, he even squatted down and held me in his arms. He sighed. "Diane, go ahead and scold me. If it makes you feel a little better, I don't mind. Really, as long as you can pull yourself together." At that time, his hands holding me were trembling. I thought Bryce would always be good to me as he had been. But I never expected that he had long been tired of it. He felt guilty towards me. He couldn't confide in me, so he could only vent his emotions through his diary. "So, did watching today's performance make you feel relaxed?" Maggie asked him with a smile. Bryce nodded. "At least the shackles on my shoulders don't feel as heavy. These 3 years, I felt like a caged bird, pitiful and pathetic." Pitiful, pathetic? It turned out that, to him, I was a shackle, a cage. Almost instantly, my tears fell like broken beads, rolling down uncontrollably. Someone accidentally bumped into me from the side. I fell to the ground, and my skirt didn't cover the prosthetic leg, causing her to exclaim, "Aw, your leg? Are you disabled?" Bryce and Maggie heard the commotion and looked in our direction. Both of their eyes flashed with surprise. "Diane!" Bryce quickly walked over to me, picked me up around the waist, and asked with concern, "Why did you come out alone? Did you get hurt anywhere?" Maggie's face seemed a bit unpleasant as she silently took a few steps back. I pried Bryce's fingers away, looking at him through tear-filled eyes. I tore off the veil of shame, word by word. Seeing her prosthetic leg, I lost all interest. What normal man would marry a cripple? How can I force her to divorce me? With every sentence I said, Bryce's face turned a shade paler. His hands were trembling. Until I said the last sentence. "Let's get a divorce, Bryce." Actually, making this decision was really hard for me. Because Bryce is my savior. He once saved my life. During the earthquake in 2008, my parents were out of town on business, leaving 12-year-old me at home alone. When I was buried under the rubble, I cried my heart out. Darkness, pain, suffocation, hunger, it all felt like an invisible monster, tearing me apart and devouring me. I had only one thought in my mind. Am I about to die? Will I never see my parents again? No. I don't want to die yet. I don't know how much time passed. I was too exhausted to cry anymore, and could only weakly tap on the wall, hoping someone would hear the faint sound. The next second, miraculously, I heard a response from above. "Is anyone there? Is someone down there? Can you tap again, please?" This voice was so familiar. Was it Bryce? My heart tightened instantly, the joy of finding hope in despair was overwhelming. "Bryce, it's me. I'm here," I shouted with all my remaining strength. But suddenly, it went quiet outside. Not long after, a ray of light broke through above me, and I squinted my eyes, unexpectedly seeing Bryce and several rescue workers. During my recovery, the nightmares of near-death wouldn't go away. It was Bryce who held my hand, soothing me over and over again. "Diane, it's okay now, don't be afraid. I'll always be with you." The days trapped underground left a huge psychological shadow. No one knew how I managed to survive. I prayed to the God every day. Prayed that I would be found. Prayed that I would live. God heard me. So, Bryce came. It was from that moment that my more than a decade-long secret crush began. After that, I fell deeper and deeper, unable to extricate myself. So, the reason that supported me to push Bryce away without hesitation in that car accident was not just love, but also gratitude for saving my life. I expressed my gratitude countless times, but Bryce just touched his nose and avoided my gaze. "Diane, it's all in the past. Don't mention it again. Besides, how could I bear to see you get hurt?" Hearing the last sentence, my heart skipped a few beats, like any girl being teased by her crush, feeling shy. Bryce leaned down and rubbed my head, teasingly asked, "Why are you blushing?" I bit my lip and didn't answer. He just smiled at me. Bryce was really great back then. His personality was bold and passionate, even though he was surrounded by admirers, his eyes were always on me. He never missed any of my performances, and after the show, he would personally give me flowers. The young man holding a bouquet of white gardenias, looking at me with eyes that couldn't hide their brightness. "Diane, you looked so beautiful dancing Swan Lake." He extended his hand to me, making an inviting gesture. "My dear Princess Odette, would you have dinner with me tonight?" I smiled and agreed. But not long after, Maggie appeared. I was sick and had to get in 4, so the teacher had her replace me on stage. Bryce didn't know about the last-minute change and, as usual, went on stage to present flowers, but froze when he saw Maggie's face. When I recovered and was discharged from the hospital, the first thing he said to me was, "That Maggie from your department is quite pretty. Do you have her contact information?" My breath hitched. He didn't even ask if I had recovered well. Just eagerly asked about another girl. I took a deep breath. Repeatedly telling myself, my crush has found a girl he likes, I should be happy for him. Really? At that time, I was even ready to let go. But fate played its tricks, and Bryce had to give up on Maggie and marry me. From the moment we got our marriage certificate, the bold and passionate boy was gone, replaced by a gentle and patient husband. But he never complained in front of me, always speaking softly. I used to think that it was because Bryce had matured after the car accident. Until today, when I heard his conversation with Maggie. I suddenly realized. It wasn't that. He also had negative emotions, bad moods, but he suppressed them with all his might. What he showed me was a perfect mask. But fake is still fake. This kind of hypocritical marriage. I don't want it anymore. The theater corridor was oppressively tense. Bryce stood frozen in place, finding my recount hard to believe. You read that diary? I nodded. He seemed to finally panic a bit, his voice coming out low and trembling. Let me explain. Explain what? I let out a bitter laugh. Bryce, you wouldn't want to say that you didn't write it, would you? Back in school, Bryce, relying on his wealthy background, never cared much about studying, and I did a lot of his assignments for him. No one knew his handwriting better than I did. He probably realized this too, opening his mouth in vain, but ultimately saying nothing. I looked at him quietly. Suddenly, the man I had been with for 3 years seemed so unfamiliar. How much of his affection for me was real, and how much was fake? Bryce, I choked as I called his name. You could have just told me. Told me that you don't love me. Told me you married me out of guilt. Told me that every day after our marriage was torture for you. By the end, I was almost sobbing uncontrollably. If I knew, would I have forced you to stay with me? Each question was nothing compared to the pain in my heart. Diane, stop. As if by habit, Bryce hugged me, wiping away my tears with his thumb, eyes full of pity. Don't cry, please? It breaks my heart to see you like this. Liar. Still lying to me. I pushed him away forcefully, stumbling back a few steps. But just seeing his face made me think of every moment from the past 3 years. Those memories were like a sharp dagger, tearing my heart apart. I felt so stupid. So pathetic. I didn't want to stay here any longer. I needed to leave. But before I could take a few steps, Maggie came after me, stopping me and getting straight to the point. Are you really going to divorce Bryce? I sniffled, suddenly catching the lingering scent of cold pine wood on her. It was the scent I was most familiar with. My nails dug into my palms, and I didn't answer directly, only saying softly. Bryce uses this brand of cologne too. Maggie gasped, then laughed and denied it. I didn't buy it. It must have rubbed off on me when Bryce hugged me on stage while giving me flowers. She paused for a second, as if realizing she had said something wrong, covering her mouth and pretending to be flustered as she explained. Don't misunderstand, Diane. There's really nothing between Bryce and me. You know, I'm an orphan with no family. Bryce was kind enough to pick me up when I returned home yesterday, and I gave him the tickets to thank him. And when he gave me flowers, I had to hug him out of courtesy. You don't mind, right? I listened with a blank expression. In reality, my heart was aching so much that I could barely breathe. Seeing no reaction from me, Maggie's gaze shifted down, blatantly looking at my crippled left leg. Her next words were like daggers to my heart. By the way, Diane, you can't dance anymore, right? Next time, come with Bryce, and I'll dance for you, okay? She invited a legless ballerina to be her audience. How cruel! Seeing the immense pain in my eyes, Maggie smiled in satisfaction and finally left. I stood there, probably in a daze for 10 seconds or so. Then I rushed out of the theater like a madwoman, only to fall to the ground in a mess. Blood oozed from my palms and knees. A white Cadillac stopped beside me, and the door opened. Bryce hurriedly ran towards me. Diane, how did you fall? I just went to get the car. Does it hurt? I'll take you to the hospital right away. I don't know where I found the strength, but I brushed his hand away, supported myself on the ground, and shakily stood up. I said to him, word by word, Bryce, stop pretending. He was hurt by my sharp words, his eyes reddening, hands trembling slightly in midair. This is the end for us. I turned around, clutching the hem of my skirt tightly, tears rolling down my pale cheeks. Bryce, I give you your freedom back. You can finally be free. I didn't go home with Bryce. Instead, I wandered aimlessly along the bridge across the river. Today's sunset was beautiful, the evening glow almost covering the entire sky. But despite the stunning scenery, I had no time to appreciate it. I leaned against the peeling railing, staring blankly at the calm surface of the river. Someone was taking pictures of the sunset, and a family of 3 was walking hand in hand. And me? What was I doing? Oh, I was thinking, who in this world is truly happy? Anyway, whoever it is, it's definitely not me. I stood on my tiptoes and looked down. The bridge across the river was really high, and the wind whistled past my ears. As I gazed down, I suddenly got the urge to jump, to end it all. But the next moment, my phone rang in my pocket. A middle-aged woman's voice pierced through my eardrum. "Diane, it's been a long time since I saw you. How about I come over tomorrow with some groceries?" Hearing family concern during a low point in life. Why does it make one cry instantly? And that crazy thought in my mind just now seemed to dissipate suddenly. I tried hard to hold back my tears and whispered, "Mom, I want to eat your sweet and sour ribs." "Okay, I'll come over tomorrow and make it for you, wait for me." After hanging up the phone, my vision was suddenly overshadowed by a shadow. A young, handsome man was looking down at me. "Were you thinking of jumping into the river just now?" As soon as he spoke, I froze. Because his voice sounded so much like Bryce's. So, I stared at him foolishly, completely ignoring his question. Until he waved his hand in front of my eyes. I snapped back to reality and studied him carefully. Although his voice was similar, his appearance was completely different. Bryce's features were sharp, giving a strong sense of aggression. But the man in front of me exuded gentleness from the inside out. "There are many ways to end your life." The man bent down a little, looking into my eyes calmly and gently. "No matter which method you choose, I can still save you. Because I'm a doctor. But don't choose to jump into the river, I can't swim." I pulled at the corners of my mouth. Actually, I wanted to give him a smile, but he waved it off. "Your eyes are as red as a rabbit's. Don't force yourself to smile." The evening breeze carried the man's lingering voice, like an invisible hand, dispelling the gloom in my heart. He said his name was Evan Nixon. He was a doctor at West Hospital. A couple of years ago, he was injured by an extreme patient, and since then, he could no longer hold a scalpel. I took out my phone and searched his name. I found that his resume was as perfect as his looks. Not only that, but he had also participated in many volunteer activities. Evan Nixon leaned against the railing, turned his head to look at me. "Can you tell me why you wanted to jump into the river?" His voice was soft. Yet it was so gentle that my tears couldn't stop falling. I closed my eyes, as if I had given up, and slowly lifted my skirt, revealing my prosthetic leg. In the past 3 years, I had suffered too much from gossip and disdain, and I really didn't know what kind of look he would give me. The air was silent for a long time. I opened my eyes anxiously, only to find that Evan had somehow squatted down. He looked at my prosthetic leg and then looked up at me. His dark eyes were filled with tiny sparks of light. "Cyberpunk style?" Diane leaned back, "You are really cool." It was also that day, for the first time, someone told me. Complete perfection is indeed beautiful. But flaws are also a kind of beauty. This sentence. I remembered it for a long, long time. When I said goodbye to Evan, it suddenly started to drizzle. He chivalrously took off his jacket and put it over my head. "Where do you live? I'll take you there." The fine raindrops wetted his hair, and his bangs fell down, covering his long, gentle eyelashes. Seeing me remain silent, he chuckled softly. "You don't want to go home, do you?" I nodded. He pondered for a moment, then took out his phone, swiped a few times, and opened a booking app. "Then I'll take you to see the stars." I pursed my lips, but before I could reply, I saw him book 2 expensive suites, the top floor ones. With a sky garden. Supposedly, there are telescopes that can see the entire starry sky. As for why 2? Evan held up his phone and raised an eyebrow at me. "It's late, it's not safe for you to stay in a hotel alone. I'll stay next door, call me if you need anything." But perhaps it was my bad luck. Even though the weather forecast said it would rain for only 2 hours, it ended up raining all night. The mist was thick, the stars were covered by clouds, and not a single ray of light could be seen. I waited and waited, then fell asleep. When I woke up, morning light had already filled the room. There were many unread messages on the phone by my bed, all from the same person. Bryce Horvitz. Diane, where are you? Why didn't you come home? Please respond, I'm really worried about you. I glanced at them and didn't reply. Soon, they were pushed down by 2 new messages. Who said there were no stars? Aren't you the brightest one? Signed, Evan Nixon. My fingertips trembled. About 10 hours ago, I had complained to him that I had waited so long in the garden and hadn't seen even a shadow of a star. This morning, he sent me a photo. In it, I was sitting on the swing in the sky garden, holding a telescope, looking at the dark night sky. The wind lifted my skirt, revealing warm-colored skin and the cold light of the mechanical prosthetic. Surprisingly harmonious. In the past, I was unwilling to face my own imperfections. Now, I long pressed this photo and saved it. The phone buzzed again. Evan sent another voice message. In a low, firm voice, he called my name. Diane, be your own star. At noon, I went back to Bryce's house. At this time, he should still be having lunch at the company. It was just convenient for me to pack my things and move out. But I never expected this. As soon as I opened the door, Bryce, sitting on the living room sofa, looked at me sharply. Our eyes met, and I saw surprise in his eyes. Bryce tightly hugged me. Where did you go last night? His voice was very hoarse. Like he hadn't slept all night, with stubble appearing on his chin. Why didn't you answer my calls? Do you know how long I searched for you? He sounded genuinely worried about me. But I didn't dare to believe it anymore. I struggled a bit and finally broke free from his embrace. For the first time, I calmly observed Bryce as a bystander. Facing a wife who hadn't come home all night, he looked worried, but the violence hidden in his eyes was still visible to me. So I thought for a moment and said bluntly, Bryce, I was with another man last night. His expression stiffened. The gentle and considerate facade seemed about to shatter. Don't joke around. Besides me, what other men are around you? As he spoke, I clearly saw a flash of contempt in Bryce's eyes. It was so fleeting that I almost thought it was an illusion. Actually, Bryce probably hadn't hidden it well before either. The disgust he felt towards me would show in certain moments. But my love for him had put a filter over my eyes. I thought he loved me, thought he was the perfect partner, and naturally ignored these details. I lowered my eyes and walked straight into the bedroom to start packing my things. Seeing that I was serious, Bryce suddenly lifted his foot and kicked over my suitcase. He seemed to finally reveal a bit of his true nature. His brows furrowed tightly, his voice carrying a hint of impatience. Stop making a scene. It's just a diary. I'll burn it, okay? Once it's burned, you can pretend you never saw it, all right? No. But before I could answer, Bryce rushed into the study and found that diary. He lit it with a lighter right in front of me. The flames quickly consumed the paper. Black words on white paper turned into a handful of ashes, like fireworks. There's no need for this, Bryce. He held my hand tightly, afraid that if he let go, I would run away. His deep voice was also a bit hoarse. Last night, I couldn't find you, I almost went crazy. I was afraid something happened to you, afraid you were mad at me, even more afraid you wouldn't want me. When Maggie went abroad, I didn't lose control like I did last night. You were only gone for a day, and my heart was about to break. He said a lot, and the more he spoke, the redder his eyes became. Diane, honey, can you say something to me, please? I was stunned for a long time. Suddenly, it all seemed a bit absurd. Are people always like this? Using the pain of separation to distinguish love? I looked at him. Suddenly, tears of laughter came to my eyes. But, Bryce, I have memorized that diary by heart. So what if it's burned? The contents of that diary were like a knife, cutting deeply into my heart. I will never forget it in this lifetime. Bryce almost knelt in front of me, his lips trembling, unable to hide his helplessness. The diary was just a way for me to vent my emotions. I thought I couldn't let her go, so I went to find Maggie. But when you asked for a divorce today, I really panicked. Diane, I've never been so scared. I regret it, I don't want a divorce. Can you forgive me this once? I looked down at him, seeing the large beads of sweat on his forehead from nervousness. After a moment of silence, I softly said, I can't. I can't forgive you, Bryce. No matter how sincere you sound. This is as far as we can go. I gave up packing my things, and as I walked to the door without looking back, Bryce blocked my way. Diane, his eyes gradually reddened, his shoulders trembling slightly. Considering I've taken care of you for 3 years. Please, stay. I pushed him away and didn't look back. Behind me, I heard Bryce's fist pounding hard against the wall. Diane, do you really have to be so heartless to me? The elevator doors slowly closed, and the mirror reflected a face full of tears. I could no longer hold back. I squatted on the ground, covering my face and crying bitterly. Am I the heartless one? Bryce, it's you who is insincere. I stood alone at the entrance of the community, trying to hail a taxi. I had just dialed my mom's number, intending to tell her not to come see me. But the familiar ringtone sounded not far away. A slightly clumsy figure got out of the taxi's back seat, carrying bags full of my favorite foods. She finally freed a hand to answer the phone, still laughing cheerfully. Diane, Mom is already in the elevator. Didn't you want sweet and sour ribs? I bought fresh pork ribs. My thoughts were a bit stunned. When I first got married, I wasn't used to using a prosthetic limb and often fell while walking. Every time my mom came to see me, she would say she was already in the elevator, so I wouldn't go down to meet her. It turns out, it was to ease my mind. Thinking of this, my nose tingled. Mom, turn around and look. My mom turned around at the sound and saw my red-rimmed eyes, looking slightly surprised. Diane, are you having a fight? I didn't want to cry anymore. But after my dad passed away, my mom was my only support. So I threw myself into her arms, crying and telling her what had happened these days. My mom listened quietly and only said one thing. Don't cry, dear. Mom will take you home. She made a table full of dishes for me, watched me finish eating, and then urged me to go back to my room and rest well. I slept very soundly that night. Until the neighbor auntie knocked on the door, waking me up. Diane, your mom said she was going to stand up for you. Why hasn't she come back yet? We're still waiting for her to play mahjong. She asked me like this. My heart sank. My mom went to stand up for me? As I got into the taxi, I was immensely grateful that I had installed a tracking system on her phone out of worry. Through the window, I saw my mom pouring coffee all over Maggie. She stood straight, scornfully scolding. If I remember correctly, in those dance competitions, as long as my daughter was there, you could never get first place. But now you dare to humiliate her, making her watch you dance. Where do you get the nerve? Maggie was stunned, probably the first time someone had pointed at her nose and scolded her. It took her several seconds to react. She wiped her face with a tissue and gave my mom a mocking smile. Times have changed. Your daughter is already a cripple. I listened outside the window. In the past, hearing this, I would have lost control. But ever since Evan praised me as cool, I seem to have gradually accepted the term cripple. After all, this is the reality. But my mom has a fiery temper and can't stand being provoked. Hearing this, she abruptly stood up, raising her hand to slap Maggie. But her wrist was grabbed. Enough. Bryce stood in front of Maggie. It's not her fault. He must have received Maggie's text and ran all the way here. Otherwise, why was his forehead covered in sweat? My mom laughed in anger. She raised her other hand and slapped Bryce hard. Just in time, I want hit you too. That slap was full of force. Half of Bryce's face immediately swelled red. Maggie screamed, wanting to argue with my mom, but Bryce stopped her. My mom seized the opportunity and slapped Bryce again. My daughter lost a leg to save you. When you married her, what did you promise me? In 3 years of marriage, if you didn't love her, you could have been honest. But you chose the most hurtful way. Bryce lowered his eyes, his jawline tight, unable to say a word in rebuttal. Mom. Don't call me Mom. Do you deserve it? The daughter I raised with so much effort is not for you to trample on. Divorce. Leave with nothing. My mom said this and stormed off in anger. I stood there for a long time. Like self-torture, I watched Maggie reach out to touch Bryce's swollen cheek, asking if it hurt. Her eyes sparkled with tears, her cheeks showing a faint pink. Bryce, actually, I thought of you every day when I was abroad. When you divorce, can we try being together? Bryce looked at her, not speaking for a long time. I really wanted to applaud him. He could finally reunite with Maggie. But to my surprise, Bryce refused. His tone was flat, revealing no emotion. Maggie, we ended 3 years ago. Then why did you pick me up at the airport? Why did you come to see my performance? Bryce closed his eyes, speaking in a deep voice. Because you were my obsession. I admit, at first, I only felt guilty towards Diane. I tried everything to be good to her, to make up for her, but I couldn't love her. So, I wrote those awful things in my diary. But I've been with Diane for 3 years. In these 3 years, I must have fallen for her at some moment, without realizing it. Otherwise, why would I feel such unbearable pain when she said she wanted to leave? Maggie, upon hearing this, seemed incredulous, her pupils contracting sharply. But you clearly said that day she was a shackle for you. Are you willing to be shackled by her for life? Bryce frowned. It looked like he was carefully recalling what he said at the theater. His expression was regretful, his tone difficult. That day, I didn't see my own heart clearly. Rather than her leaving me, I'd rather be shackled. Maggie's thin frame seemed unable to support itself, her face pale, her smile more painful than crying. Okay, I understand. Can you hold me one last time? Just like you hold her, hold me, please? Her eyes filled with tears, she looked at him pitifully. Even I felt soft-hearted, let alone a man. Sure enough, Bryce hesitated for a moment but eventually agreed. Maggie, like a butterfly with broken wings, threw herself into his arms, closing her eyes. I love you, Bryce. As soon as she finished speaking, she slowly tilted her head up, kissing his lips. Bryce was stunned but didn't push her away. I stood outside the window, watching the scene, feeling my stomach churn. So disgusted I wanted to vomit. Is this your love for me? Bryce, your love, how can it be so cheap? My eyes were wet with tears. But the next second, my vision went dark, and I couldn't see anything. The hand covering my eyes had a long scar. Evan's voice. So softly, it fell into my ear. Diane, this place is too dirty, let me take you away. Evan took my hand, and as we left, Bryce's gaze met mine. His pupils trembled violently, panicking. Diane, don't go! The sound faded in the evening wind. On the neon-lit street, a pair of kindred spirits, like fleeing from the end of the world, eloped to a place where no one could find them. One was a doctor with a wounded hand. The other, a dancer with a broken leg. Evan's shirt and my skirt fluttered in the wind. He took me to the other side of the riverbank, where there were no towering buildings, no bustling streets. Only vast, endless grasslands. He and I stood side by side, watching the sunset fall into the distant starry sky. Someone said, when the sky first darkens, the first star that appears is called twilight dawn. That's the end of the old, the beginning of the new. Evan looked at me deeply, while I quietly waited for his next words. He smiled and said to me, Diane, maybe, it's time for us to embrace a new life. Evan's new beginning was resigning from his department to teach at the medical school. He said that although he could never pick up a scalpel again, he still had a wealth of knowledge and clinical experience to pass on to the younger generation. After hearing this, I looked down at my prosthetic limb and sighed softly. Missing out on one's dreams is truly a regrettable thing. A warm hand gently ruffled my head. I looked up and met those star-filled eyes. But Diane, at some point, he had stopped calling me by my full name. There is more than one way to achieve your dreams. How? My eyes lit up. He pointed to the university campus not far away, where medical students in white coats were gradually filing into classrooms. Supporting others in achieving their dreams. That's pretty cool too. Isn't it? The brilliant sunrise burst forth from the eastern horizon. My heart trembled suddenly. Perhaps. I was also about to have my own new beginning. The day the lawyer prepared the divorce agreement and I signed my name and sent it to Bryce was also the day my long-planned ballet training studio opened. Its name was New Beginning. Many familiar faces came to the event. My teacher, former classmates, and even Maggie. Unlike others who offered congratulations, Maggie looked around with a disdainful gaze and sneered. "Diane, don't you think you're being too naive? What parent would entrust their child's future to a cripple? I think you'd better stay at home and stop causing trouble." I thought for a moment and didn't get angry. I led her into a room. On the snow-white walls hung all the gold medals I had won from the age of 5 when I started learning to dance until the car accident at 23. Golden and heavy. I danced Swan Lake, always the first place. Maggie's expression finally showed some cracks. She probably remembered the days in school when she was overshadowed by me. So her departing figure seemed so hurried. I smiled. "Is this all you can take?" But I, Diane leaned back, "will not stop here." Light footsteps sounded behind me, and someone stood steadily by my side. Looks like I wasn't wrong. "What?" Evan turned his head and looked at me seriously. "You are the brightest star." He was standing a bit too close, beyond the normal social distance. I knew I should step back, but I felt rooted to the spot, with only my heart pounding fiercely in my chest. Bang bang! The sound of a door being kicked open came from behind. Bryce stood at the door, looking much more haggard, tightly clutching the divorce agreement. His knuckles were white. "Diane, I don't want to sign." The room was dimly lit. As I walked closer, I saw that Bryce's eyes were frighteningly red. "If you have any objections regarding the division of property, you can talk to my lawyer." Facing him now, I was very calm. But Bryce suddenly went mad. He tore up the divorce agreement and grabbed my hand tightly, not letting go. "No, honey, I don't want a divorce." I really couldn't understand the man in front of me. Clearly, it was he who said he had no interest in me. Clearly, it was he who said he regretted marrying a cripple. Clearly, it was he who wanted to force me to divorce. And he had already embraced and kissed Maggie. So why was he now acting like he couldn't bear to part with me? The man's strength was really great. I struggled several times but couldn't break free. When I turned back, wanting to seek help from Evan, a gust of wind blew past. Bryce was suddenly kicked to the ground by someone. I looked at Evan in shock. So, even someone who seemed gentle to the core could be so fierce in a fight? "Who the hell are you?" Bryce's cursing suddenly stopped. The moment he saw Evan's face, I caught a glimpse of his instant panic. Could it be they knew each other? "Diane." As I was pondering, I suddenly heard Bryce call my name. He staggered to his feet, his hand wiping across his lips, leaving a glaring red mark. He pointed a trembling finger at Evan and questioned me. "Are you insisting on divorcing me because you already know that the first person who found you during the earthquake wasn't me, but him?" Like a thunderbolt, I was stunned. The first person to find me wasn't Bryce, but Evan? I didn't know how to describe my feelings at that moment. Evan was also taken aback. It wasn't until he carefully scrutinized Bryce that his expression gradually turned to realization. "That day, the person I stopped, was it you?" Evan said. "In the earthquake relief efforts of 2008, West Hospital sent out many medical personnel. At that time, he had just come of age. Despite his father, the dean's objections, he insisted on volunteering. He was indeed a person with a strong sense of responsibility. Perhaps it wasn't my fate to die." That day, Evan happened to be resting less than half a meter away from me. The faint knocking sound gradually caught his attention. Then, he discovered me, trapped underground, barely alive. After the disaster, the base stations were completely destroyed and communication equipment was rendered useless. He could only go back to find the rescue team, but he got injured on the way. So, he stopped a young boy nearby. "So, all these years, I've been mistaking someone else?" The dim room fell into endless silence. After a long while, I heard my own dry, raspy voice. "So, all these years, I've been loving the wrong person? The God who saved me from disaster wasn't Bryce at all. He lied to me. He lied about even this." Tears streaming down my face, my hands trembling, I grabbed Bryce's shirt collar. Why Bryce? I had thanked him countless times before. He obviously had so many chances to explain to me, but he didn't. He even ambiguously said, "How could I bear to see you get hurt?" Bryce lowered his eyes, his gaze unfocused, completely unable to look at me. Mumbling, "Diane, I'm sorry." Sorry? Did he even know what that meant to me? It meant my long-standing crush of over 10 years began with a perfect misunderstanding. I risked my life to protect him only to find out I had been repaying the wrong person. I bit my lip hard, not letting myself make a sound, my eyes already filled with tears. "Bryce Horvitz, I've always wanted to ask you something." Bryce lifted his head, his eyes, once like dead water, suddenly lit up with a flickering light. He looked at me cautiously. "What?" I took a deep breath. "Did you always know I liked you?" "I knew." "Then did you know when I started liking you?" "That earthquake." I laughed self-deprecatingly. "So, he knew all along." "I told you, I was trapped under the rubble for days and nights, covered in wounds, with no food or water. I didn't dare to think about how I survived each second. So, when I was found, I was so grateful to be alive, so grateful that you found me. I really saw you as my savior. But you've been lying to me all along. The earthquake was like this, and our marriage too. You said that the moment I asked for a divorce, your heart ached terribly. You said that after 3 years of living together, you also developed feelings for me. But why didn't you avoid Maggie when she kissed you?" One thing after another. "Bryce, we've known each other for so many years, doesn't it hurt you at all to treat me like this? Am I such a bad person? Why do you always make me cry?" Bryce's eyes were red. He just kept saying sorry over and over again, and then fled in a panic. The cold of late autumn rushed into the room, the wind was too strong, blowing tears into my eyes. After a long while, a distinct, bony hand handed me a tissue. I didn't take it. "Evan, did I look like a madwoman just now?" In the tear-blurred vision, he silently and stubbornly shook his head. "No." He cupped my face, gently wiping away the tears hanging on my eyelashes. "Our Diane is just too sad." My tears flowed even more. He sighed silently and pulled me into his arms. "Cry, I'm here with you. Thank you. Thank you for being the first to find me during the earthquake. Thank you for praising me as cool when I wanted to leave this world. Thank you for telling me to become my own star." When the first snow of winter fell, my divorce case with Bryce was nearing its end. He refused to sign the papers. There was no other way. I had to file for divorce. For the past 3 months, I received almost daily letters of repentance. It wasn't hard to guess who wrote them. I didn't read any of them. I packed them all up and threw them in the trash. On the day the judgment was issued, I took away most of Bryce's assets. 5 houses in the city center and a few luxury cars. I didn't refuse. This was what I deserved. As I walked out of the courthouse, Bryce silently followed behind me. It wasn't until I hailed a cab to leave that he called out to me. "Diane," he paused, still seemingly holding on to a glimmer of hope. "Can I pursue you again?" I didn't stop walking and got into the car. Through the car window, I could clearly see the bloodshot veins in his eyes. My thoughts suddenly became a bit hazy. In the past, I had once humbly asked him, "Bryce, do you love me?" But what did he give me in return? Thinking of this, I lowered the car window, waved the still warm divorce decree in my hand, and answered almost mercilessly, "No." The moment the word fell, the light in Bryce's eyes extinguished. I didn't look at him again. The car started, and Bryce and I went our separate ways. Never to cross paths again. I met Maggie again at a ballet competition at the end of the year. The 2 students I taught had smoothly passed the preliminary round, and today was the semi-final. Maggie sneered at me backstage. In front of everyone, she said that I had fallen from grace for a man and become a cripple. Naturally, the students I taught were also worthless. I smiled and didn't argue. For the past few months, I had been getting up early and staying up late to guide my students in their dance practice. They were very diligent, even though my demands were almost harsh, they never complained. So, I knew clearly who the winner would be in today's competition. After the judges scored the first round, I saw a trace of jealousy flash in Maggie's eyes. Noticing my gaze, she said bitterly, "It's just the first round. I won't always be trampled under your feet." I raised an eyebrow and smiled at her. Let's wait and see. After the judges scored the second round, Maggie's delicate face had become almost hideous. She stormed into the competition's restroom in high heels and said a few words to her student. I didn't pay it any mind. I couldn't blame Maggie for being anxious. After all, there was only one round left. Who would win or lose would soon be decided. But I never expected an accident to happen during the third round. A few thumbtacks were placed in my student's ballet shoes. Fortunately, she remembered my advice to check her shoes thoroughly before putting them on. Otherwise, the consequences would have been unimaginable. The judges reviewed the surveillance footage. It was confirmed that Maggie's student had placed them. And before she went to the dressing room, she had only been in close contact with Maggie. Thus, the truth came to light. This incident caused quite a stir, and Maggie was directly expelled from the industry. She also faced charges of inciting harm. Before being taken away, her eyes were filled with resentment. Diane, why do you always get to be on top of me? Why does Bryce prefer you, a cripple, over being with me? Many people around whispered. They were discussing my prosthetic limb, as today was the first time I wore a short skirt. Facing these gazes, whether friendly or disdainful, I smiled serenely. Hello everyone, I am Diane Lindbeck. I used to be a ballet dancer, and now I am a teacher. A few judges passing by were attracted by my mechanical prosthetic limb. They extended an olive branch to me, inviting me to develop in a broader field. They said, Diane, your students are just like you. They are the undisputed champions. I stroked the brand new gold medal, thinking that there was still a long road ahead. I, Diane Lindbeck, would not stop here. I accepted the olive branch extended by the judges. Decided to take my students to a bigger city to develop. I thought my mom would be worried or try to stop me. But after hearing it, she just nodded calmly. Go, it's such a good opportunity, only a fool wouldn't go. Then, on the night before we left, she went to bed very early. I thought she was angry and saying the opposite. Who knew the next day, my mom had even packed her luggage. She said, wherever my daughter goes, I go. My nose tingled. I couldn't help but want to cry. But when she mentioned moving the whole family, I burst into laughter through my tears. The high-speed train was crowded on Saturday. I was in the first row of the business class. If I turned around, I would see a familiar face in the seat diagonally behind me. He had a scar on his palm and was holding a bouquet of pure white gardenias. The flower language of gardenias is silent waiting. Waiting for you to see my sincerity and love. The last time Bryce heard about Diane's recent situation was at the end of this year. His mother, while shopping for New Year's goods, mentioned it casually. Diane is moving away. Let's send more to her family this year. Bryce's body suddenly stiffened. Moving away? Where to? Suddenly, he lowered his head and laughed self-deprecatingly. Diane had long blocked all his contact information. How could he possibly know? Fortunately, although he and Diane were divorced, the elders of both families still occasionally kept in touch. So, Bryce asked indirectly, is Mrs. Lindbeck really okay with her going so far away alone? How could she be okay with it? After hearing this, Bryce finally breathed a sigh of relief. He thought, as long as Diane was in the same city as him, he could still take the opportunity of bumping into her to see her again. But in the next second, his fantasy was completely shattered. So, they are moving the whole family. What does moving the whole family mean? Does it mean they won't come back in this lifetime? His heart trembled violently. Bryce suddenly panicked, and even his thoughts began to blur. He remembered the first time he met Diane. She was just a 7-year-old girl. She liked to chase after him, tugging at his clothes and timidly calling out, Bryce. Bryce was 2 years older than Diane. When he was in the second year of middle school, the little girl was still in 6th grade, knowing nothing and practicing dance in front of him without any reservations. The ballet outfit outlined the young girl's graceful figure. Bryce blushed and looked away, lowering his head to do his homework, a few drops of bright red nosebleed falling on the paper. He knew he was done for. The name Diane Lindbeck was destined to linger in his mind. That early summer, in May, a major earthquake occurred in Sea City. Bryce had gone to another province for a competition and luckily escaped the disaster. But Diane wasn't so lucky. She was trapped underground for 3 days and nights, which was already the physical limit for a 12-year-old girl. Bryce searched the ruins near her home many times. To no avail. Just as he was about to leave in despair, a stranger stopped him. Later he found out. That man was Evan Nixon. He said a girl was calling for help, but his leg was injured and asked Bryce to find the rescue team for help. Bryce went. It was the best decision he ever made in his life. Because the girl who was rescued was Diane. During her hospitalization, Diane often had nightmares, waking up crying in the middle of the night. Bryce visited her, looking at the thin and pale face on the hospital bed. His heart ached. He held her hand, comforting her over and over again. "Diane, it's okay now, don't be afraid. I will always be with you." Later, Diane indeed gradually got better. She started to cling to Bryce, treating him better and better, almost unconditionally. Every time, Bryce's friends would tease him. "Diane is so pretty and well-behaved, aren't you moved?" Bryce remained silent. Of course, he wouldn't admit it. But the more you try to avoid something, the stronger that thought becomes. He knew Diane liked him because of the life-saving grace and treated him well. So he went along with it and deceived Diane. He admitted he was selfish and hypocritical, but that was Diane, the girl he had liked since he was 12. He liked her shining on the stage. Diane dancing in Swan Lake was the eternal true princess. Those years, ambiguity grew wildly. Until Maggie appeared. She and Diane had two different kinds of beauty. If Diane was a pure white gardenia, then Maggie was a flamboyant red rose, stunningly beautiful. He was attracted by that appearance. Eagerly, he pursued Maggie to deepen their relationship, but no one expected that car accident to happen. Bryce felt guilty to the point of madness. He knew Diane liked him, so he asked Mrs. Linebeck to let him take care of Diane for a lifetime. But he overestimated his own character. Promises are light and easy to make. But actually doing it is really hard. He had to face an emotionally unstable disabled person day and night, massage her, accompany her in rehabilitation, and make her happy. It was very, very exhausting. Over time, the youthful excitement had long been worn away. He began to resent this kind of life, resent this foreseeable future, and even resent Diane. But she saved his life. How could he dare to expose his negative feelings towards her? So, that diary was born. Like Pandora's box, filled with his malice. On the surface, he was a gentle and considerate husband, but inside, he was full of disgust for his disabled wife. He wished Diane would take the initiative to ask for a divorce to end this torturous relationship. But when she really asked for it, Bryce regretted it. He once thought he still had feelings for Maggie, but the night Diane disappeared, he felt an inexplicable panic. What kind of feeling was that? It was like being shot through the heart. The pain was unbearable. Then he realized, actually, he had long fallen in love with Diane. Otherwise, why would he feel like his heart was breaking every time she cried? He had asked Diane more than once, "Can you not leave?" The answer was always no. If this time he didn't go after her, with Diane's carefree personality, maybe in this lifetime, they would never see each other again. "It's snowing outside, where are you going?" Bryce didn't answer. He wanted to go after his ex-wife. I was woken up by the sound of conversation. "Wow, look at that white Cadillac. Crazy, it's going so fast, almost keeping up with the high-speed train. What's going on? Is some CEO chasing after his wife?" I followed the direction they were pointing. My heart skipped a beat. That car, I knew it all too well. It was Bryce. At the same time, a call from a local unfamiliar number came in. I answered. The sound of the wind roared in my ears, accompanied by the shallow breaths of a man. He called out to me, his voice hoarse beyond belief. "Diane, I miss you." The roaring engine noise shook my eardrums, getting louder and louder. "Are you crazy, Bryce? What are you doing? Do you want to die? Stop." Bang! It seemed like something smashed the windshield. But outside, that car seemed reckless. still accelerating. Diane, I'm begging you, stay. I know I was wrong. Don't go. From now on, I'll just watch you from afar, I won't bother you anymore. Please, don't leave me, okay? I was so shocked I couldn't speak. I kept holding the phone, nervously looking out the window. Bryce, stop. If you keep this up, you'll die. He turned a deaf ear. Until a loud bang. An explosion erupted in my ears. He seemed to have hit the guardrail or something, finally stopping the car, letting out a painful groan. Diane, the man's voice gradually faded into the wind. What a pity. I haven't told you yet. Actually, I fell in love with you long ago. The last few words were so light they were almost inaudible. That night, a news headline titled "Cadillac Chasing High-Speed Train" dominated the front page. His driver's license was revoked, banned from driving for life. He even lost 2 legs. My hand trembled as I read the news, and the phone fell to the ground. The screen shattered into pieces. A well-defined hand picked it up for me. Met the gentle eyes of a man. I was stunned. What are you doing here? Evan lowered his eyes to look at me, a casual smile on his face. Here to chase my star.